The Evolution of Art, Part 2. Every work of art is the child of its age, and in many cases, the mother of our emotions. It follows that each period of culture produces an art of its own, which can never be repeated. Efforts to revive the art principles of the past will at best produce an art that is stillborn. I'm starting out with this quote by Kandinsky because I want to reinforce the idea that art, in this sense of art with a capital A, art with cultural import, is art that responds to the time in which it is made. It reflects the sentiments or politics or cultural interests of its contemporary context. So, remember how portrait paintings accurately captured the appearance of a person? Well, before photography, that was the point. Portrait paintings were an homage to the memory, wealth, beauty, age, or status of a person. The paintings survived after the person died, and only the wealthy could afford to be painted, or had the status that a writer would want to record and print. As a racial aside, those with status within the Western canon were always white. Portraits of non-whites were either archetypes of race, like this painting titled The Black Boy, or they ended up somehow without titles or names, like these portraits. Occasionally you can find an exception, but for the most part our histories center upon the privileged and the white. And we know about dead rich people because their recorded memories with names and titles survive long after their lives end. Once photography hits the scene, it's an affordable way to capture the image and memory of a person or a moment in time. It's the average person's way of becoming part of the visual narrative of culture. There's even post-mortem images of the dead. Oftentimes, when children died, parents would arrange a family portrait with the deceased child as a memento mori, a way to remember them as a member of the family before they were forever buried in the earth. I'm telling you all of this to emphasize how much photography, as image-making technology, really changed painting and consequently the very purpose of making art. There were still portraits painted after photography. I mean, there's still a large market for portraits to this day, but the purpose of these portraits is built upon status. In the here and now, photography captures the likeness of a person, and portrait painters try to bypass the photographic qualities and usually create these canned, second-rate images that are passed off as more valuable than the photograph. So clearly, the purpose of the portrait rests more upon the status of the medium. Painting is more unique and expensive than photography, rather than the quality of the image itself. Enough of my ranting about poorly painted portraits for people who can't tell the difference. Let's go back to photography. Remember how artists, freed from the constraints of having to accurately render the world, begin to experiment with their mediums? If you don't remember that from the last lecture, you're breaking my heart, so go back and review. Anyhow, that eventually leads to artists breaking away from the conventionalities of Western tradition and trying new things that were super underappreciated at the time. And to trigger your memory, artists are layering goopy paint of varying colors to explore how we, viewers, perceive light, or Vincent van Gogh is slathering paint and abstracting nature to explore the possibilities of emotional expression through his work. Paul Gauguin, obsessed with the allure of non-European aesthetics, adopts bright colors and stylized shapes to celebrate his inner noble savage and exoticize his Tahitian subjects. Paul Cézanne is leaving canvases half-painted to call attention to the image as an illusion. Instead, it's a constructed object, and you can see the materials of the construction, the canvas and paint, which takes precedence over the representational qualities of the image. He also alters perspective, like Monet, to change our understanding of the window into another world. And Picasso takes this further, splintering our experience of art, temporality, and the world. He fractures time and space and mass and then spreads it all out over the canvas to see all at once. Then you have the motion junkies who are influenced by the technologies of the day, like the movie camera and the automobile. And of course, there's Vasily Kandinsky, dubbed the father of abstract art, who utterly departs from representation and simply paints lines, shapes, and colors that do not represent anything in this nameable world. And that provides the segue into the story of modern and contemporary art. So let's start out with this. If artists aren't expected to copy nature or represent things in this world, if they don't have to create an illusion, a window into another world, and if they don't have to even reference anything in this world, then what good are they? What is the role of the artist and the purpose of what they produce? Well, my friends, that's where we delve into the Western idea of genius. So, the idea of genius has its roots in Roman culture. It's this spiritual guide of a person, place, or family that opens a divine connection to the will of the gods. A person had a genius. They weren't themselves a genius. Western culture, and remember the Western canon and the culture itself traces its source to Greeks and Romans, evolves this idea of genius to be an individual of higher intelligence that becomes celebrated by society or the particular field that individual is contributing to. So the characteristics of a genius would include higher intelligence and insight, an originality unconfined by the status quo, an understanding of and engagement with the world that is not common to the average man. They're special, far superior to people like you and me. And because they are so special, they rise in the ranks of society because society recognizes their specialness. Connotations of genius include divine inspiration, a disregard for the inconsequential concerns that dominate the thoughts of the average person, unique qualities and talents that set them apart. Sometimes their genius is not even recognized until after their death because they are so smart, so original, so sensitive to the zeitgeist that their works and thoughts surpass the time in which they lived. Geniuses are prophets of the age to come. But here's where things break down. Genius, with a capital G, is societally conditioned. Here's what I mean. While you might think of someone you know as a genius, why aren't they as recognized, as intelligent as Einstein or Edison, as creative as Picasso or Van Gogh, or as strategic as Napoleon, Genghis Khan, or George Washington? I mean, they might be smart, but are they bringing forth revolutionary changes to society? Perhaps the above-mentioned geniuses were just at the right place at the right time, and they get the credit for a societal shift that was on the verge of happening anyway. Or perhaps social circumstances and class play a role. Let's look at Thomas Edison. Edison started out as a curious kid who was mostly taught by his mother. He sold newspapers and snacks on trains and used his hard-earned cash to invest in a home chemistry laboratory and even a laboratory on the train where he worked, which eventually caught fire and got him fired. So, before the fire accident, Edison is an interesting kid who knows how to make money and use it to geek out at home. Then a turning point. One day, while 13-year-old Edison is in the train yard getting ready to sell newspapers, he sees this 3-year-old playing on the tracks. A train is rapidly approaching, and Edison runs out and rescues the toddler from getting squashed. The toddler's dad, who is also the station master, shows his appreciation by teaching Edison how to run the telegraph machine. Something to note, this was a circumstantial thing that completely changed Edison's life. If this hadn't happened, would Edison have had the opportunities, thanks to a telegraphy job that funded his early work, to pursue various inventions? Also notable, Edison really only invented one thing, an electric voting machine that politicians didn't like because it hindered their abilities to lobby. So after that failure, Edison focused on bettering pre-existing inventions to make monies. And he had a huge workshop where a lot of other inventors worked for him. But he's the one who gets the credit because he's the one who headed the workshop, the brand. Or take Van Gogh. We would have never known about Van Gogh unless after his death, his sister-in-law reached out to an auction house to get connected with wealthy art collectors. Van Gogh only sold one piece in his entire lifetime, and when he was sane enough, worked odd jobs and was financially dependent on his brother. Van Gogh lived a poor, often lonely life and committed suicide at age 37. It wasn't until his work reached the collections of the wealthy that he became recognized as a genius. And Napoleon, Washington, and Khan, they were all from recognized noble or aristocratic families, which was a big plus when you're seeking allies for military conquests. Here's where I'm going with all of this. To be a genius, with a capital G, there's status involved. You either have to come from status or rise up the ranks. It's not just this identity bestowed upon you by some divine power. But all of humanity has a need to look for something greater, whether a religion or anti-religion or wealth or reputation, social acceptance, social justice, or celebrity. We want heroes, and geniuses are placed on a pedestal of reverence. But the reality is, there are so many happenstantial circumstances that are not in our control that then factor into the creation of a so-called genius. Whether the person is born into wealth or happens to survive a war or rescues a kid from a train. And I'm telling you all of this because it's an important foundation for the Western art canon. We pinpoint Mozart, Da Vinci, Chaucer, and others as the geniuses of Western civilization because at some point they had to acquire a privileged status through circumstances not of their own making. Also, if you haven't already picked up on this, did you notice the geniuses I mentioned are all men and European, with the exception of Genghis Khan? It's not that women or non-Europeans lack intelligence or insight. It's that the social opportunities that lent themselves to the genius label were historically only available to men of social and economic means. A brief example, Frederick Douglass. Yes, he gained notoriety in his lifetime, but was it really genius? He's famous for having escaped slavery and being a leader of the abolitionist movement. But here's what you may not know. Frederick Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century. He had a not-so-secret obsession with photography. In fact, in addition to the lectures he gave on abolition, he also lectured on photography. And these lectures are really ahead of their times. In them, he talks about the image's power to convey a respectful, dignified visual representation of a black man. He also wrote about photography's reproducibility and circulation, the performance of a sitter before the camera, the objective and subjective qualities of a photograph, even the death-like nature of preserving a visual symbol at a particular moment. These lectures were given in the 1860s. Interestingly enough, all of these ideas are credited to European philosophers who wrote about them around 60 years after Douglass. These European philosophers, Walter Benjamin and Roland Barthes among them, are considered icons, geniuses. But Douglass's essays of photography have never even been formally published to this day. So are European men of economic and social import the only geniuses that exist? Is genius the natural ability of a semi-superhuman? Or does circumstance play a major role in the genius label? Hint, I'm trying to convince you that it is the last of these three. Okay, let's take this back to the original question. What is the role of the artist in the Western canon, particularly as it plays out in the 20th century? These artists are not supposed to maintain traditions. They're supposed to challenge them. Artists are upholding conventional aesthetics. They're breaking them. Artists are supposed to make original artworks of cultural insight that communicates the zeitgeist. They reach deep down into their innermost feelings and psyche and express themselves upon the canvas. The role of the artist, then, is to be a genius in the most divinely inspired, romanticized sense possible. I personally think that sounds ridiculous, but the romanticized notion of a genius has deeply stained the art world, and it's not easy to scrub out. If you're a genius artist in the early 1900s, you're a white European male arguing with a white European male tradition. It's just the way things were. But I want you to keep this in mind because when the Western canon unravels throughout the 20th century, a male Eurocentric art narrative unravels. So let's delve into the unraveling. We left off with Kandinsky, the Russian painter who totally departed from representational painting. Please note, this wasn't or isn't the end of representational art. A lot of artists out there are still making works like this representational portrait by John Singer Sargent, or this abstracted representational work by Pablo Picasso. But the option of going rogue is out there. Artists have the choice to completely divorce themselves from representational painting. Also keep in mind, all of the world is falling apart. Between 1914 and 1918, Europe is engulfed in World War I. After years of upheaval, Russian revolutionaries are overthrowing the Tsar in 1917. For the most part, America is a podunk blob on a map that has minor political power. If you're going to look at this from the Western canon perspective, artists of the early 20th century are making some crazy work in response to some crazy civil unrest. And the art center is Europe, particularly Paris. So if you're an avant-garde artist, you want to be in Europe, which is also the center of all the craziness. And right now I'm going to throw a lot of artwork at you that's being produced throughout Europe around the time of World War I to give you an example of what I'm talking about. This is from an article written by Rosie Lesso for The Collector, an online humanities publication. The Blue Rider Group, in German Der Blaue Reiter, was a radical art collective that congregated in early 20th century Munich, Germany. Rejecting the traditional realism of past art, they strove instead to create spiritual, symbolist art that came close to abstraction. This group took their name from a painting by Wassily Kandinsky that featured an unknown man in a blue jacket riding into a distinct landscape. And, much like the lone rider in Kandinsky's painting, they too rose off into unknown and uncharted territories, daredevil adventurers in the realms of art. The leading figures in the Blaue Reiter group, together, altered the course of art history. Just an aside here, Kandinsky wasn't always painting non-representationally. I mean, he had to have some sort of historical progress, so he was painting representationally prior to his breakaway. He moved from Russia to Munich in 1896. From there, he became the figurehead for new modes of self-expression. In his own art, Kandinsky's language became increasingly expressive and vivid, with bold strokes of intensely bright color as he moved closer to his uniquely spiritual brand of pure abstraction. He wrote, "The artist must train not only his eye, but also his soul, so that it can weigh colors in its own scale and thus become a determinant in artistic creation." Kandinsky's art profoundly shaped the work of his contemporaries as they sought to emulate the concepts and qualities of his art within their own. Along with Kandinsky, German painter Franz Marc helped found the Blue Rider group. Much like Kandinsky, his art was eccentric and colorful with a cubist quality. But Marc's paintings focused predominantly on animals that seemed to merge into one with their surroundings, including horses, cows, and foxes. His art became a powerful antidote to industrialization, noting how animals live in close, symbiotic harmony with the land. In 1912, Kandinsky and Marc edited the Blue Rider Almanac. This published album features essays by world-leading painters, composers, and critics, along with eclectic illustrations by a diverse range of artists. The overriding theme of the almanac was an emphasis on the spiritual in art. And this thematic focus encapsulated the spirit of the times, and it has since become one of the most important documents in the early 20th century. Swiss-born artist Paul Klee found his true artistic voice as a member of the Blue Rider group. Kandinsky, in particular, became a mentor to Klee, encouraging him to experiment with syncopated abstract designs and gradated patches of color. A life-changing trip to Tunisia with Maki, another artist in the Blaue Reiter group, qualities of light he wanted to capture in his own art. From here onwards, he began painting in a most entirely abstract way. Also, in Germany, Die Brücke, or The Bridge in English, was an art group that employed a similar expressionist style. Another contributor to The Collector, Marianne Ploss, writes, "During the first few decades of the 20th century, societal upheavals transformed Germany. The country saw a drastic metamorphosis from an empire at war to a republic at peace. As soldiers came home from the Great War and the public witnessed these rapid social changes, there was a clash of cultures at a time of transformative modernity. Urban cities were at a crossroads between the country's violent past and modern life, fostering a new movement that sought to find meaning in this world." Expressionists used their art in order to represent their emotions about the world around them. Influenced by the poignant paintings of Vincent van Gogh and Edvard Munch, German Expressionism was a form of escapism and gave a space of societal commentary for its artists, who were at a crossroads between the past and the future. During this time, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was a founding member of Die Brücke. The group's works, with their bright colors and lack of traditional composition, contrasted sharply with the academic, realistic art preferred by the bourgeois society. The artists of Die Brücke and the Blaue Reiter painted with thick brushstrokes and represented abstract, colorful figures. These techniques were used to put the painter's own emotions at the forefront of the mind and as conveyed by the subject depicted on the canvas. The fears of modernity presented in German Expressionist art came to a head when the Great War was declared. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination thrust the world into the trenches, and Germany was an indispensable member of the Central Powers, along with Austria-Hungary. Generals sent their soldiers to the battlefield to defend their country on French soil, but the horrors of the war found them there instead. And this horror, of course, had dramatic impacts on the lives of German expressionists, especially those who enlisted. Ernst Ludwig Kirchner was taken off the front lines after a mental breakdown, and other artists were killed in combat. So, a quick recap. The expressionists are using distorted forms and bright colors to convey personal and communal responses to society's frantic breakdown. Artists are also looking to the spiritual realm without institutional religion as a means of salvation. And there's an emphasis on individuality and self-expression. So, moving on to Austria at this time, Egon Schiele was making drawings that severely distorted the human figure and focused upon sexuality in an aggressive way that many of his critics deemed perverse and pornographic. He embraced a bohemian lifestyle that rejected societal norms and emphasized personal experience and discovery. A contemporary of Schiele, Anton Hanak, was making malformed human figures that accentuated the devastation of war. After creating this piece, Hanak wrote, "And when we pause and our eyes have been freed from blindness, we see the image that is actually most familiar to us, but which has almost been erased by the war. Behold the man. Without something to hold on to above and below, entirely impotent, he has been deserted by everything that once surrounded him. Mankind has forgotten about man." Then you have some really crazy stuff with Dadaism. Again, Rosie Lesso. Dadaism was an avant-garde German art movement that emerged during the early 20th century in direct opposition to World War I. After experiencing the horror and devastation of war, artists congregated in Zurich to express their shared disdain for the hypocrisies of bourgeois society that had led them into war. Such feelings of rebellion, anger, and disdain were the founding principles of Dadaism, which veered towards nonsensical, meaningless, anarchic, and satirical. Artists took these ideas into various forms of art, poetry, and performance. The movement later developed centers around the world, including Berlin, Paris, and New York. The Dada movement began in Zurich in 1913, founded by the German writer Hugo Ball and the German artist Richard Huelsenbeck. Together, they established the Cabaret Voltaire as a hotspot for experimental creativity, inviting anyone brave enough to perform or make a statement here amongst an audience of left-wing radicals any night of the week. They argued that a new brand of ridiculous art was the only answer to the senselessness of war, which he called civilized carnage as a triumph of European intelligence. Ball and Huelsenbeck named the movement Dada for its nonsensical name, with multiple interpretations meaning yes, yes in Romanian, rocking horse or hobby horse in French, joyful, foolish naivete in German, and in many countries, the first words a child will speak before being introduced to the language of the bourgeois society. This anti-intellectual approach fit with Ball's notion of poetry, which he argued should be moving away from conventional language in the same way that modernist art was gradually erasing form and representation. In contrast with earlier art movements, there was no conventional unifying aesthetic underpinning Dadaism. Indeed, the movement encompassed a huge variety of approaches and methodologies, with a distinctly anti-art approach, a desire to overthrow convention and shock audiences used to viewing art in a certain way. Games and theater, while others embraced collage, photomontage, and found object sculptures as a means of tearing apart or subverting the ordinary. As an aside, collage was already existent in Cubist paintings, but Dadaists really ran with it, cutting out words and images from everyday newspapers, magazines, and food containers. In appropriating non-art objects and images, Dadaists stretched the bounds of what could be considered art. It was no longer just paintings and sculptures. Materials could be found in streets, the kitchen, or even the garbage. What is more, collage enabled artists to create not from a blank slate or canvas, but from already existing items. The act of creation now included selection and arrangement. Anyhow, Lesso goes on. Dadaism is often cited as the first conceptual art movement, as artists associated with the movement challenged the notion of art as the practice of craftsmanship and skill. They rejected traditional ways of producing art, such as painting and sculpture, arguing art should be about the idea and the mind rather than the act of making. French artist Marcel Duchamp was instrumental in defining this conceptual strand of Dadaism with his ready-made sculptures, which took pre-existing objects and translated them through minimal acts of intervention into works of art. So, there's a nonsensical drive that underpins Dadaism, and if we focus on Marcel Duchamp's fountain, it addresses all of the nonsense he saw in the art world, in the Western canon. Rosie Lesso writes, Duchamp's fountain, made in 1917, is quite possibly the first ever conceptual work of art. Nowadays, art galleries are filled with all sorts of weird and wonderful objects, but back in Duchamp's day, it was a far more traditional affair. Duchamp was one of the first to bring manufactured artists. Duchamp was one of the very first to bring manufactured objects, which he called ready-mades, into the gallery space. His fountain was a particularly attention-grabbing ready-made because it was such a crass, crude object, even if the one he bought was brand new. This was also important to Duchamp because he wanted to subvert traditional good taste. He argued that anything could be a work of art, good, bad, or ugly, as long as the artist chose it and called it art. In doing so, Duchamp demonstrated that the concept behind an art object was more important than the thing itself, and this became a cornerstone of conceptual art. Duchamp used his fountain to upturn deeply entrenched ideas about art. One of the most important ideas he questioned was the concept of originality. Before Duchamp's day, artists were largely expected to produce one-off, original works of art, signed with the artist's name to prove its authenticity. But Duchamp and his fellow Dadaists threw all of this into question with the frequent use of found objects and multiples. In fact, with the encouragement of the French Surrealists, Duchamp went on to make multiple versions of Fountain in the 1960s, using the same type of urinal and signing it with the same strange pseudonym. Duchamp even made a miniature version. While the original version of the fountain is now lost, the idea has lived on through these later multiples. Once again, Duchamp proved that the idea or concept is more important than an original handmade object. Duchamp submitted Fountain to the Society of Independent Artists group exhibition, a society for which he was a founding board member. The society claimed they would accept any art for display, rejecting the elitist formalism of Paris's stuffy art institutions. But Duchamp wanted to use this work to see just how open-minded they really were, and if they really believed in the freedom of expression they claimed to promote. To hide his identity, Duchamp submitted the work under the name R. Mutt, signed crudely on the urinal in black paint. Duchamp thought if he revealed that the work was by him, the other board members would accept it without question. But under an unknown name, the society had to analyze the object and the idea. When they rejected it for being indecent and immoral, Duchamp challenged the principles of the board members and their supposed tolerance to daring new ideas. Duchamp was one of the first to produce art under an anonymous pseudonym, but later on many would follow his examples. Wait, what? Duchamp submits the work anonymously? But aren't artists supposed to be recognized as the authors, the creators, the geniuses behind their work? Duchamp's ready-mades, and particularly the whole fuss around Fountain, are a turning point in the genius breakdown. You may not like Fountain aesthetically. I mean, it's a urinal. Its chief purpose is that of a literal piss pot. But by not making, rather selecting the object in question and recontextualizing that everyday object within the art realm, the gallery, Duchamp asserts his authority as a studied, institutionally certified artist who has the knowledge and reputation to say what is and isn't art. In a paradoxical way, he's using his authority to debunk authority. Basically, Duchamp is asking, what is a work of art? Does an artwork have to be made created or original? Is the art of his time supposed to be beautiful or even judged aesthetically? Can an artwork be judged on the basis of concept rather than aesthetics, the visual qualities of the artwork? Does the context determine the work? In other words, if an object is in the bathroom with the purpose of catching pee, it's not art because it's not an art context. But if the same object is put in a gallery or museum in an art context and called art and addressed as an object of contemplation, does that mean it is certifiably art? Does the artist's genius rely in making a work, or is the artist a sort of cultural agent, insightfully responding to the zeitgeist? And therefore, whatever they label as art, as long as it's the artist's intention and fits the spirit of the times, is in fact legitimate art? Duchamp throws into turmoil all of the ideas that the Western canon is built upon. Ironically, he's held as an artistic genius for overthrowing genius. Anyhow, next week we're going to look at how his ideas play out in the rest of the 21st century and into contemporary times. It's like if photography freed artists from representation, the ready-made frees artists from originality and creation. So now what are artists supposed to do?